Hotel Lima Alpha.
Greetings, friends. I'm glad you've joined us. Have you ever moved into a new place and after a little while it just started feeling weird? Sounds, smells, and changes in the air that aren't quite right? In tonight's tale, a man moves into a place that may already be occupied. Ejected by a ghost. I had taken my chambers in Grace Square Inn and was inclined to like them. They were on the second floor and consisted of 3 rooms. The door on the landing opened into a narrow passage, at the end of which, on the right, was the door to the sitting room, the 3 windows of which looked into a dingy green expanse, where stood a few tall, gaunt London trees. In one corner of the sitting room was a door leading to the bedroom, which communicated with a dressing room. The dressing room had a door leading to the end of the passage, to the left of the main entrance from the landing. Thus I could make a complete circuit of my premises from the sitting room through the bed and dressing rooms, into the passage, through the passage into the sitting room again. I am anxious to be understood on this point, as a realization of the topography of the place is necessary for the comprehension of the incidents I have to relate. I will premise by assuring my reader that at the time of which I am speaking, I was in thorough physical health. As is the case with most sucking barristers, I rather prided myself on cultivating a habit of mind that should not permit me to be unduly impressed by causes unwarranted by calm reflection. I had been accustomed to a sedentary and to some extent solitary life, and in moving to Grey Inn Square had determined to apply myself unremittingly to legal studies. My new chambers had been unoccupied for some months, and after making sure that they had been well cleaned and scrubbed, I sent my furniture and took possession. It was on a chill, dark October evening that, after dining at an accustomed eating house, I wended my way to my new quarters. I shall never forget that evening. There was a heavy, clammy feeling in the air of the streets, and as I turned into the dreary square, the air seemed heavier and clammier. On arriving at my chambers, I found a deaf-spirited, sodden old creature who had attached itself to me as laundress and charwoman in the act of setting out to tea things. The lamp was lighted and the fire burned bright in the grate. On my coming in, the old woman mumbled a few words, the meaning of which I did not catch. However, well pleased with the air of comfort she had imparted to the place, I wished her a cheery good night, and she went out. Having closed and locked the outer door, I returned down the passage into the sitting. I can perfectly call to mind its appearance on that night. The polished furniture was gleaming and glistening in the light, the windows were veiled by thick curtains, and the door leading into the bedroom stood ajar. I congratulated myself on my possessions, and having poured myself out a cup of tea and lighted my pipe, settled myself with a volume of Hallam in an armchair by the fire. I had been reading for some time. My attention had somewhat wandered to a vague, sleepy consideration of matters not strictly relevant to constitutional history, when I became aware of a strange, all-pervading sensation of cold. The sensation was so sudden, so acute, that I rose from my chair shivering, in expectation of finding one of the windows open, but no, they were all closed and fastened. Through the panes I could discern the gaunt branches of trees, unstirred by any gust of wind. On glancing around the room, I noticed the flame of the lamp, which, though somewhat dim, did not flicker, or seem agitated by the icy stream of air that chilled me to the bones. The bedroom door, as I have mentioned, was ajar, and thinking the draught might have proceeded from one of the inner rooms, I lighted a candle with the intention of looking through them. But the instant I entered the bedroom, the candle went out, not suddenly, as from a current of air, but quietly, instantaneously, as though it had been introduced to an atmosphere of carbonic acid gas. At the same moment, the sensation of cold came over me with 10 times greater intensity than before. The gas light in the square shone feebly in the rooms, and I was able to find my way through them into the passage and back into the sitting room. My sensations appeared to be somewhat unaccountable, but attributing them to some draught, of which I could ascertain the cause of in the morning, I closed the doors and resumed my place by the fire. After a little while, I fell again into my interrupted train of dreamy thought and gradually fell asleep. Now, before proceeding further, I may state that I have never been the victim of nervous fancies. Nothing had ever occurred to me bearing the remotest sway of the events that I am about to relate, events so utterly inexplicable by natural causes and yet so fantastically real, that even after a lapse of many years, I call them to mind with a shudder of horror. I remember as though it were yesterday the appearance of the room as I mused lazily in my armchair before going to sleep. The sound of an organ which was playing in some neighboring street came to me fitfully, at times seeming to be almost close to me, and at times, again, seeming to proceed from some great distance. The fire had burned low, occasionally cracking and ticking. The lamp, as I have mentioned, was burning dimly, and a portion of the room was in deep shadow. I do not know how long I slept when I became conscious of my own being. I cannot say I awakened, for though all my mental faculties were struggling painfully into life, my vital action seemed suspended, and I was unable to move hand or foot. Cold perspiration burst from all my pores, and I made tremendous but vain efforts to shake off the incubus that was upon me. My feeling was not one of impotence. It was as though I had been frozen into a solid block of ice. I endeavored to call out, and had no power over my voice, and could not utter a sound. But as I gasped and panted, there stole into my nostrils a deadly, terrible, overpowering stench, unmistakable in its penetrating sickliness to me who had frequented hospitals. It was the dread odor of decomposing mortality that was suffocating me as I sat. I felt that I must break the spell or die. With one terrific exertion that strained every nerve and muscle, I burst from the chair and fell cowering on my knees before the fire. The lamp had gone out, and a faint gleam from the fire afforded the only real light in the room. I relighted the lamp, and having swallowed a glass of brandy, endeavored to collect my thoughts. The hideous odor still clung in my nostrils, and the absurdity of such supposition did not strike me. I searched the room, but of course found nothing. As though to my astonishment, the bedroom door, which I had carefully closed, was wide open. As I advanced towards it, with the intention of shutting it again, my lamp was extinguished by the same unaccountable manner as before. I locked it, however, securely, and again struck a light. By this time I had sufficiently recovered to endeavor to reconcile my sensations to natural causes, or at any rate to a formidable attack of nightmare. I lighted my pipe, in hope of neutralizing the terrible stench that still pervaded the room. Leaning on the mantelpiece, I actually smiled, beholding my own pale, scared-looking face in the mirror. As I looked, suddenly every pulse in my body stood still. I beheld the reflection of the bedroom door, which gradually, noiselessly, opened of itself. I tried to command myself, and turned round towards the door, the same intense thrill of cold, but not a soul was there. I considered for an instant, and cross-examined myself as to my own condition. It was evident that my nerves were completely unstrung, and I decided, as I saw reflected in the looking-glass my own ghastly-looking face, that I was not in a condition to investigate the matter further for that night. Dread was upon me that I could not shake off, so hastily putting on my greatcoat and hat, I hurried out of the room through the passage and found myself on the landing with a sigh of relief, locking the outer door, and walked to the rooms of a friend who lived in the neighborhood. S., who was reading for the Indian Civil Service, was glad to see me, and offered me a shakedown for the night. I informed him at once of the cause of my ignominious flight from my own rooms. My experiences had been too unmistakably real for me to dread ridicule in the relation of them. So, confessing unreservedly that I had been almost frightened out of my wits, I sat patiently enough that as he endeavored to prove satisfactorily that my sensations were entirely due to nerves or indigestion. Before retiring to rest, however, we agreed to spend the following night together in my chambers. In the morning we each went to our respective duties, with an arrangement to meet at dinner that evening. I did not call at Gray's Inn Square during the day. What with attending lectures and reading tough law, had not only overcome any idea of supernatural agency in the events of the preceding night, but, as the evening drew near, entirely ceased to think of the matter. It was about 8 o'clock when we entered the rooms together. The old laundress had evidently been at work, as on the preceding evening. The fire was burning brightly, the lamp was lighted, and the tea things were set out on the table. We walked through the rooms and found everything in perfect order. S. laughingly envied me my comfortable quarters, showing by his manner that he was more than ever convinced that I had been the victim of exceedingly bad attack of nightmare. After a little while we agreed to play chess, and arranged a small side table in front of the fire. I sat in the armchair with my back to the bedroom door. As on the previous night, S. was seated opposite me, consequently facing the door, which I had closed, locked, and bolted, on completing the tour of inspection. S., who was in high spirits, joking at me the while. I remembered, however, the uncomfortable tendency it had to open on its own account, and determined that it should be as securely fastened as a good lock and bolt would admit of. We were both fair chess players, about equally matched. 2 hours perhaps had elapsed, when the interest of the game culminated. and we were considering it with an intenseness known only to chess players. The move was with me, knowing it to be a critical one. I was considering it at length in all its aspects. My decision was just formed, and I was on the point of moving a piece when gradually, surely, I became aware of the same extraordinary sensation of cold as on the night before, just as if the surrounding atmosphere were becoming iced into solidity. I felt that the bedroom door behind me was opening. I looked up with the intention of calling S.'s attention to the phenomenon, but my movement was unnecessary. He was equally conscious of it with myself. He had risen from his chair, and I can never forget the expression on his face, which was livid and distorted. His eyes were wide open and turned full on the door that was behind my chair. All his features were convulsed, and his appearance, as he bent forward as if in an intensity of horrified expectation, was perfectly terrific. I actually saw his hair lift from his head, and great beads of perspiration burst from his forehead. He took not the slightest notice of my movement, but slowly raised one hand as if pointing at something in the room behind me. Then suddenly, without giving me a moment's warning, with one loud yell of agonized terror, he dashed to the door leading to the passage, through the passage and out of the main door, which slammed heavily behind him. I hurried after him into the passage, and then remembered that the outer door closed with a spring lock, and that the key was in the pocket of my greatcoat, which was hung up in the bedroom. We had inadvertently left the door open on coming in, and thus S., who had been unable to escape. It would be impossible for me to describe my feelings at finding myself alone in the passage. How long was it before I mustered up sufficient presence of mind for reflection I cannot tell you, but at last I realized to myself the fact that to leave my chambers it was necessary to get the key. With desperate courage I returned to the sitting room. The lamp was extinguished, the fire was burning with a sickly glare. With closed eyes I advanced into the bedroom. I quickly felt my way to the peg on which my coat was hanging. Then something happened that caused my very heart to stand still and my blood to freeze. I heard movement in the passage, a strange, heavy, shuffling sound, as of a body dragging itself along the floor. An impulse seized me, unaccountable as all the other events of that memorable night. I felt impelled to follow the thing, painfully, slowly dragging itself down the passage. I stepped through the dressing room, and as I moved, I heard it move before me, keeping the same relative distance from me. I quickened my pace. I ran, but I still could not overtake that which I heard dragging itself along. After 3 or 4 headlong rushes from room to room, I stopped in the middle of the sitting room to recover breath. As I stood, a revulsion of feeling came over me. My eagerness to confront and discover the cause of the sounds I could still hear gave way to horror. I felt my life and reason to depend on my escape. As I moved to the bedroom door, it closed in my face. I frantically endeavored to force the lock. The thing was dragging itself along the passage into the room in which I was. Again the nauseating stench of the night before rose to my nostrils, and I rushed to the window with the intention of throwing it open and jumping into the space beneath, but it was too late. I turned my eyes downwards. It was close to me, and I beheld it. A man, writhing on the floor, his features blue, bloated, and decomposed. The eyeballs turned up, yet bearing full upon me, dead and glassy, an impure phosphorescent light emanating from the body itself. As I gazed, one discolored hand was raised to the throat, in which I perceived a hideous gash. It drew itself gradually closer to me. I became insensible. When I was discovered in the morning, my friends, who were telegraphed for, removed me to the country, where, amongst cheerful scenes and people, I soon recovered. S died of brain fever within 3 days of the night on which he sat and watched with me. I have never cared to make any inquiries about the previous inmates of the chambers. It is true I have heard that an inmate of one set cut his throat under peculiarly horrible circumstances, but I was never curious to identify the scene of the suicide's death with the chambers I occupied for so short a time. Indeed, nothing would ever induce me ever again to enter Gray's Inn Square. That's it for tonight, but I'll be back tomorrow with another tale. Until then, good night, whatever you are.